The year of 2020 has been a messy one, and it's about to get messier. The presidential election of 2020 is ramping up to have some serious issues, especially with the pandemic being front and center. The coronavirus has affected the lives of Americans between finance, health, and politics. A shadow of doubt and concern has been cast over the system put in place for democracy to operate and over democracy itself. From voting interference, the results, and the aftermath. This is the chaos of the 2020 US presidential election. As the pandemic began taking place, health officials urged people to stay at home to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. As a result, this had an effect on the number of people willing to work at polling stations, causing less polling stations to be available and caused lines to become longer. There is also the risk of catching the coronavirus when in such publicly dense places such as the polling stations as well. As an alternative, voters would request mail-in ballots instead, with many states encouraging to do so as well to protect the public health. Millions of voters are now relying on the Postal Service to cast a vote during the pandemic. However, back on May 6, 2020, months before the election, Louis DeJoy was selected to become the Postmaster General and CEO of the United States Postal Service by its Board of Governors, all of which were selected by Donald Trump. DeJoy became the first person in decades to lead the Postal Service without any experience as a letter carrier whatsoever. Right away, this had become a concern for many, as DeJoy has had history with Trump, hosting a fundraiser for Trump in his own home, donating more than $1.2 million to Trump and the Republican Party, and once overseeing fundraising for the Republican National Convention.
Ah! It's not a liquid! It's a great many pieces of solid matter that form a hard floor-like surface! Ah!
Once sworn into the Postal Service office, DeJoy immediately began making severe changes to the postal services, from the banning of overtime and extra trips to deliver mail, dismantling hundreds of high-speed mail sorting machines, and the removal of mailboxes from city streets. With all these changes made, mail was beginning to pile up and become delayed. Not only was this problematic for voting, but for urgent packages as well, as dead baby chicks would be found in their packages after weeks, food would spoil, and prescribed medication would be delayed. Although DeJoy has since testified before a few committees and announced he would be suspending the operational changes until after the election, the damage has been done, with the Postal Service even sending a letter to 46 US states warning that their services may not be able to keep up with each state's deadline for the requesting and casting of absentee ballots. All the meanwhile, Trump has been falsely advocating for the fraud of voting by mail, calling it a fraud like you've never seen, and even accusing a West Virginia mail worker to be selling ballots. Voting by mail has been proven to be safe and secure, despite the many false claims Trump has made. According to a 2017 study by the Brennan Center for Justice, the rate of voting fraud overall in the US is between 0.00004% and 0.0009%, a percentage of which Trump has greatly exaggerated, while also stating that the coronavirus deaths being 4% is nothing. Even with the mail-in ballots that do make it on time for the deadline through the chaotic changes made at the Postal Service, interference will still be made. Mail-in ballots are not perfect. They have many flaws of which Trump's legal team will take advantage of, as technical errors are more commonplace, from supplying a new address, using a different version of a name, a difference, incomplete or missing of a signature, failure to properly seal the envelope, incorrect placement of information, and more. For in-person voting, poll workers would be able to catch and fix these errors. But with mail-in ballots, if one mistake is made, the entire vote may be thrown away, as no one will be able to fix those errors. With Trump's legal team, they may especially be more strict on in-mail ballots this year, targeting key states and purging votes vital for Democrats. Not only is voting by mail being sabotaged, but so is voting in person. Republicans are recruiting 50,000 volunteers in contested states to monitor polling places and challenge voters they deem suspicious looking, with no specific criteria. Regardless of the processing of votes, they will still lead us to the results, which will be just as convoluted. Typically, the victor of the election can be predicted within just a few hours before polls even close. However, with the circumstances of voting this year and the large number of mail-in ballots that are expected to be double that of 2016, the results of this election will instead be extended to allow mail-in ballots to be properly counted. In fact, several states will not begin counting the mailed ballots until Election Day, and not before. Instead of an election night, we can expect there to be more of an election week. According to a Research Center poll, Trump supporters have expressed a significant preference for in-person voting with distrust in voting by mail. As a result, Trump is expected to be ahead on election night based on these immediate in-person votes. But over time, as mail-in votes are being counted, it is expected that Biden will take the lead over Trump. Votes that are counted, reported, and later on tending to favor the Democrats has been dubbed the blue shift. To further ensure the path to victory, Democrats will be challenging the initial results as inaccurate and fraudulent, as mail-in ballots have yet to be counted for, insisting and fighting to extend the amount of time allowed to count mail-in ballots for as long as it will take to count every vote. In the fight for doing so, they will be catching a lot of heat and accusations of interfering with the process of the election, a consequence of which they will have to deal with after the fact. It is predicted that the states of Texas, Georgia, and Florida will be the ones to turn around the results of the election after election night. The president is expecting the result of the vote to end up in the Supreme Court of Justice, which may have already been impacted by his appointment of Republican Amy Coney Barrett, resulting in a Republican majority of 4-5. The last time we have seen a case like this where the results of the election are so controversial that they end up being decided upon in the Supreme Court was in the election of 2000 of Al Gore and George W. Bush. As votes were being tallied, it turned out that in the state of Florida, there were about 1,700 votes that separated the candidates from each other, with Bush taking the lead in the state, while Gore had won the popular vote overall by over 500,000 votes. But in the United States, it's winning the Electoral College that matters. As Bush's lead was so narrow in Florida, with the margin of victory being less than that of 0.5%, a recount of all votes were required. After the recount, it would show Bush's lead in Florida to be by a mere 327 votes out of the 6 million votes casted in Florida. This led to a month-long series of legal battles, which eventually landed in the Supreme Court of Justice, where it wasn't until then that Gore ultimately conceded to Bush, as the Supreme Court had voted 5-4, a Republican majority, against further recounting of the votes. As President Trump is expecting the vote to ultimately land in the Supreme Court, we can see the reason Trump was in such a rush to fill the Supreme Court of Justice seat with Amy Coney Barrett. Whether the victor of the election of 2020 will either be Trump or Biden, one thing we do know for sure is that Trump will not concede. Trump has been asked directly during both this campaign and the previous one whether he will respect the election results. He left his responses dangerously vague. However, the worst case scenario is not that Trump rejects the outcome of the election, it's that he may use his power to prevent a decisive outcome against him. As the expectation for Biden's victory is to be unorthodox, as results will be determined after election night, Trump could use this to his advantage. Trump could fight for the period allowed for mail-in voting being counted to be cut short, rendering many Democratic votes to be useless. Even if he is unable to bring the counting of mail-in ballots to a complete stop, Trump's legal team is currently laying down groundwork that would delay the results of the vote in vital states, causing uncertainty as they raise questions on the legitimacy of the votes and the processing of them. And there is nothing legally wrong about both of these. According to constitutional law expert Jonathan Turley, all candidates have the right to contest results in federal court. It's not up to the candidate to decide if an election is valid. It's not based on their satisfaction or consent. They have every right to seek judicial review. As a result, Trump's legal team could delay the results of those votes with much debate, causing the election to stagnate, potentially up to Inauguration Day, where even if both Biden and Trump shows up to be sworn in, one of them already has the powers of presidency. The stakes for Trump in 2020 are high. If he loses, he will lose his immunity from criminal prosecution the moment his successor is sworn into the White House. Even if the election concludes that Biden is the winner, according to Trump's former lawyer, there will be no peaceful transition of power. It may be concerning thinking about what could happen. The election is already expected to be unprecedented with the pandemic taking place. From the interference of mail-in voting with the damage Louis DeJoy has done to the Postal Service, the results of the election night being prolonged into an election week, and its likelihood to end up in the Supreme Court, similarly to Gore v. Bush of 2000, and Trump's vague answers on how he would handle the results of the election. A lot is on the line for this election, and only time will tell what would happen.